This is an ABC podcast.
Cast your mind back to when giants roamed the world. Strange creatures with exquisite colours and bizarre exaggerated features. That's right, I'm talking about the age of vaudeville. Hello, Kirsty Melva with you for The History Lesson. And today, comedian David Rose is our MC as he spends this year's pandemic lockdown discovering a very personal story. It's about a life lived on stage, the parallels of history, and a surprising family legacy which dates all the way back to the music hall era. This is Only Joking.
Hello, everybody. Hey, I want to tell you something.
I bet you're wondering who the hell that is. Maybe you're thinking, gee, Richard Fidler sounds weird. Or maybe you think there's a problem with your audio. Don't worry, there's nothing wrong with your audio. That's just the voice of my great-grandfather, the Hebrew music hall comedian Julian Rose.
Is his race even that important?
It's more important than you'd think. We'll get back to that later. First, though, I want to tell you how I came to be interested in Julian's life. Being funny has always been important to me. High grades, popularity, success with women, none of that mattered as much as telling a great joke. Ironically, if I had been good at any of those other things, I probably wouldn't be a comedian today. I still remember getting my first laughs at grade 6 camp with a stolen Dave Allen routine.
The first funeral I ever went to, and believe me, this is true, I was 6 years of age. And as they lowered the box into the ground, the priest said, "In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost." And I, for years, used to bless myself and say, "In the name of the Father and the Son and into the Holy Ghost."
Little did I know, the gift of the gag was genetic. It turns out, from the late 1800s to the mid-1930s, my great-grandfather, Julian Rose, was amongst the biggest stars in comedy. I'd been researching to find out what I can about my famous ancestor. My first breakthrough came by accident, after I received a message from Daniel Appleby, an expert on all things Julian. Daniel wanted to know whether I, David Rose, might be related to the famous Julian Rose. You see, Daniel too has an intimate family connection to the early days of music hall.
I'm a retired lawyer, but I was a history graduate. And since I retired, I've written a lot of British Jewish history, some of which has been published. I also wanted to research my own family history. My father was a musical performer in the 1920s. He was a light comedian and a dancer. And when I was researching into his life, I ended up in newspaper libraries reading back copies of The Stage and Era and something called The Performer. And I found to my astonishment that there was a genre of comedy which existed in Britain in the early 20th century called Hebrew acts. When I delved into that more deeply, I found that there was an important individual in the history of this genre called Julian Rose.
Hebrew vaudeville specialty introducing Parody On, Then I'd Be Satisfied with Life by Julian Rose, Edison Record.
Julian started in comedy in the 1890s. He was an accountant working for the phone company in Philadelphia. And according to legend, he used to entertain his co-workers by doing jokes and monologues in Jewish dialect.
Hello, everybody. Hey, last week I want to take my wife out for a drive in the park.
He himself was from a Central European Jewish background, and he could do this stuff very well. He had a half-brother called Henry Lee, who encouraged him to branch out into actually performing for paid audiences. And his first gigs were private venues in and around Philadelphia. And he did so well on this, he moved to New York in the late 1890s and started doing gigs actually in vaudeville. And he was a hit almost from day one. And within 2-3 years, he was signed up to a big circuit of vaudeville theatres, and he was touring in the west of the United States. And then around about 1904, 1905, he went back to try and make it big on Broadway.
Julian was renowned as a fast talker. He was said to deliver his act at the rate of 200 words per minute.
I said, what do you want? He said, excuse me, please, I got downstairs the horses what you order. I said, all right, I lift in the wagon, I keep the horses up, knocked with the whip. We was riding both.
Julian wasn't just a regional star in America. His act took him all over the world. He toured in Europe, South Africa, and even... that's right, the land down under.
Julian arrived, first of all, in 1911 in Australia. He was acclaimed. He was even more acclaimed when he came back in 1924. It was something new, something Australians hadn't seen, a fast-talking American Jew, talking in a kind of Polish Jewish accent. It was refreshing. I think I'm a Brit, so forgive me if I'm speaking out of place, but I always have the impression that Australia, before and after the First World War, felt a little bit forgotten. A little bit out of the way, and was desperate to see something new and fresh. And Julian provided that.
On the boat trip to Australia for Julian's second tour, his wife gave birth to a baby boy, who they named Melbourne in honour of their destination. Thank God it didn't happen on the way to Dubbo. My great-grandfather was so well received in Australia, he even influenced the comedians working here. In the memoirs of the comedian Roy Reen, published in 1945, Roy cites Julian Rose as a major inspiration. Here is one of Australia's most celebrated Jewish comedians, John Safran, reading from Roy's memoirs.
I was working at the Princess Theatre when the cast kidded me into doing some imitations of the famous Julian Rose. It was supposed to be an imitation of Rose, but I was no more like him than a fly in the air. What started as a joke in the first place turned out to be the most important thing that ever happened to me in my career. That piece of fooling led me to my eventually developing into a real comic.
Another bride, another groom, another sunny honeymoon, another season, another reason for making whoopee.
Around the mid-1920s, Julian moved from the United States to the UK, and it was there that he had a second burst of success. In England, Julian wasn't just a star on the stage, he also released records and starred in films. For the kids listening, records were a primitive form of audio communication, a forerunner to the technology we now know as podcasts. Films are what you would call TikToks, except much, much longer. Scary stuff.
Let's hear something that's better. And this was recorded on a cylinder phonograph that's not that great.
I'm still amazed by the accent. I can't understand how anyone could tell what he was saying.
Well, it's not so difficult if you know how to do it. You can really do a pretty good job when you want to.
In January of this year, I was in America to perform some shows of my own. Whilst there, I tracked down Hebrew comedy collector Charles Sokol. Charles owns one of the largest collections of Hebrew comedy anywhere in the world, and he was kind enough to play me some records made by my great-grandfather. What year does this date from?
The cylinder is about 1906.
When anybody goes to a wedding nowadays...
As Charles and I are talking, he brings out a recording of Julian's, a routine called Levinsky at the Wedding. Levinsky was Julian's most famous routine, and one which he did for years. Here's a small sample of Levinsky at the Wedding.
I want to get married too. But every time I want to marry a girl for love, I find out she ain't got any money.
Do you know how many would probably have been made of this recording? How many copies?
I would think somewhere around 500 to 700,000.
Not too bad for an accountant from Philadelphia.
Levinsky. Gentlemen, your presence is requested. Right away from the presents. They wouldn't wait till a fella comes to the wedding, they want the presents first.
Not everybody was a fan of my great-grandfather's work, though. Here's Daniel Appleby again, Julian's unofficial biographer. explaining the troubles Julian often found himself in.
There's been a tradition in Britain going back to 1912 that once a year variety artists for charity would put on a performance for the King and Queen. So Julian goes on in 1930, the Royal Command performance. He does his usual shtick in front of the King and Queen, King George V and Queen Mary. Observers regard the King and Queen as not being able to understand really what the jokes were about. They seem a bit puzzled. And the whole thing is broadcast live on the BBC, and the Jewish Chronicle goes absolutely ape about this denigration of the Jewish people by Julian Rose on the radio and before the King and Queen.
Remember I said we'd talk about the Hebrew comedy thing? Yeah. My great-grandfather was a Jewish man, and his comedy played with Jewish stereotypes extensively. But Hebrew comedy wasn't the most sensitive art form. To some eyes, it looked a little anti-Semitic. Take, for example, the clothing that Hebrew acts wore on stage.
Jews would go on stage, kitted up in extraordinary gear with false noses and crepe wigs and broken-down shoes and long coats, and they would tell jokes which mocked other Jews. They would ridicule other Jews, and this stuff went down a storm.
Claims that Julian's act relied too heavily on anti-Semitic stereotypes may be one of the reasons he left for England. Many Jews felt that Hebrew comedy did more harm than good. Julian may have even been blacklisted by Jewish groups in America because of his act.
The reason why we talk about blue humour, if you were a comedian on stage in one of the vaudeville theatres, which was being run by this particular booking agency, and your act contained some element which wasn't proper enough, a bit too rude, a bit too risky, management would give you a blue slip to tell you, cut this out of your act next time round. And if you refused to accept the blue slip that the agency gave you, instantly you'd be blackballed. Now, there's some suggestion that Julian Rose, he refused to follow his blue slip, and on that basis he was kicked out of the circuit.
My great-grandfather's troubles didn't end in London. Here's a report I found from a British newspaper, published before Julian made the move there permanently.
Julian Rose, the music hall comedian who pokes such fun at Yiddish characteristics, has had an unpleasant experience with a stern critic. The matter was explained at Old Street Police Court on Wednesday, when he appeared to a summons charging him with having assaulted Alfred Jacobs at the Shoreditch Olympia on the evening of June 1st. The complainant, Mr. Jacobs, expressed disapproval at some of the points the defendant put forward as Jewish character. When the turn was over, complainant Jacobs was accosted by the manager of the theatre and told to go. He was dragged out and forced behind the scenes, where he was held by two men, and the defendant, Mr. Rose, struck him in the face. Asked what was the remark of the defendant, to which he objected, the complainant Jacobs replied that the defendant said, "How do you know they were Jews?" And answering his own patter, Rose said, "Because they went to a wedding and came away with all the silver spoons." The defendant, Mr. Rose, said that in regard to the criticism of his jests, he himself was of the Jewish faith.
I have to be honest, as a comedian, that story made me laugh. I can't tell you how many times I've wanted to do the same thing to a heckler. Mazel tov, Julian.
We all had to sell our shares, our houses, our barns, our shops.
Here's another example of Julian's approach to Jewish humour, taken from his 1933 film, Money Talks.
That makes us all friends, but Einstein says we're all relatives. What does he know about it? I had to put up the money for this show, otherwise the actors would have starved. And after I seen the show, I'm sorry they didn't.
Julian plays a Jewish financier who, in order to make £100,000, must first lose all of his money. Unfortunately, every time his character invests in a money-losing enterprise, he accidentally makes money.
You people are trying to make me feel like a multi-millionaire, and I ain't used to it. My father always said, when you're in Rome, you gotta do as the Romanians do.
The plot hinges on the idea that a Jewish person will do anything to make a dollar. It's troubling stuff. Wasn't there another guy in the 1930s who said weird stuff about Jewish people? Who am I thinking of? Oh, that's right. Henry Ford! No, wait. Walt Disney. No, wait. Charles Lindbergh. Geez, America, what's with all the racists? I'm glad you're past that now. There is an argument to be made from the other side, though. Julian's act and Hebrew comedy in general may have served a different purpose than mere race baiting.
If you want to know my kind of Jewish credentials, I guess.
I'll let my friend, the comedian and podcaster Alice Fraser, explain.
I'm half Jewish. My dad's side of the family is Jewish. My grandmother and my grandfather on that side are Holocaust survivors, and I think that is the part of my Jewish identity that is important to my idea of self.
That part is the part that's important? The Holocaust survivors?
For me, yes. For me, that is the thing that makes it important that I'm Jewish. It makes it important for me to maintain that identity because I'm not that Jewish.
No.
But I'm Jewish enough to feel how dangerous or precarious it is to be part of a minority. I'm Jewish enough to have a real sense in my gut that people and civilization and the social contract are all very fragile, all very delicate, all worthy of being preserved. And certainly I think comedy is a way of simultaneously poking at and destabilizing social norms and the social contract, and also reinforcing a sort of a safety feeling in that if you make people laugh, they can't hate you.
Alice's perspective is very interesting. Perhaps Julian wasn't undermining the Jewish community as some of his detractors claimed. Maybe the reverse is true. Maybe he was lampooning anti-Semitism by showing what those stereotypes looked like.
In the context of a society where anti-Semitism is rife and dangerous and people don't know anyone Jewish, having and people are afraid of Jews, for example, then having a silly, funny clown Jew might be a useful thing in terms of beginning to break down that hostility and that fear.
If Alice is correct, what happens once Jews assimilate into a culture? Where do all of the silly, funny clown Jews go? Apart from the ABC, of course. I went to New York City, Julian's birthplace, to see if I could find an answer. And who better to speak to than Noam Dworman, the owner of the Comedy Cellar in New York and a proud Jewish man. I'm here with Noam Dworman.
Hello.
Noam is the owner of the Comedy Cellar in New York. The Comedy Cellar is a bustling club, sort of a mecca for comedians. Noam and I sat down at a busy table amidst the hustle and bustle to chat about Jewish representation in comedy.
In terms of Jewishness specifically, do you feel there is more, less Jewish comics than perhaps conventionally?
Comics? There's less Jewish comics than there used to be. I don't know what the reason is. I saw an article recently about how there's fewer and fewer Chinese restaurants in Manhattan, and one of the reasons they gave was that as Chinese people become more and more affluent, their kids just don't want to go into that business anymore. And I wondered, I said, well, maybe as Jews have become more and more successful in so many of the professions, maybe just fewer and fewer of them are trying to scrape by in showbiz like they used to, you know? Like, there was a time when there weren't that many opportunities, and a lot of people tried to make it in showbiz.
All of this talk has given me an identity crisis. I've always felt a very strong connection to the Jewish community, but is it kosher for me to call myself a Jew? Is it even kosher for me to have said kosher 3 times? Let's check back in with my friend Alice Fraser.
I think you have a right to it. It's your heritage, it's your blood, it's, this is your family, this is where you come from. Identity is such a mutable thing. I guess where it's relevant and useful to you, you should feel comfortable with it. But certainly the process of wrestling with anything is a very Jewish thing. My granny always used to say, never trust a rabbi who believes in God. 2 Jews, 3 opinions. There's all these sayings that I think go to the heart of that struggle with Jewish identity that is part of Jewish identity.
Good Lord. As if identity politics weren't confusing enough. So in order to identify as a Jew, I need to question my identity as a Jew? The less Jewish I feel, the more Jewish I become? Oy vey, I need to lie down. All of this research has me thinking, what is Jewish comedy anyway? To learn more, I got in contact with Devorah Baum. Devorah is the author of the book The Jewish Joke. It's very, very funny. I hope to be included in the second edition.
Yeah, I suppose one of the contentions of my essay is that being Jewish is a joke. So it's just whether or not you get that joke. And I suppose there is broadly a historical argument that this is predominantly shaped by modernity and the very tenuous position in which Jews found themselves in modernity, where humour was the only language really available to them to negotiate modern realities. But I suppose I'm making a claim that all the way back to the Bible, we can find a whole host of jokes, including, the most terrifying moment of the trial of faith and Abraham and Isaac on Mount Moriah. And Isaac, the Kabbalah says that was a joke. The Zohar says that was a joke, a big joke by God. But also Isaac's name means laughter. So there's a lot of actually quite explicit references to the humorous in the sacred texts. What you very often find in Jewish humour is a kind of intimate relation to the macabre. There's a kind of sort of no-nonsense practical dealing with it, or with death. And similarly with God, God is addressed very often as an equal. There's a kind of intimacy there. Someone you can kvetch to, someone who's let you down a little bit, who's someone you know pretty well. And you find it hard to sort of act all reverential towards.
I was curious to know what Devorah would make of my great-grandfather. So as we were talking, I emailed her a photo of Julian Rose in full Hebrew comedy regalia.
Oh gosh, yeah. He's an anti-Semitic stereotype. He also looks like many people I know, so but I think he's meant to look like he likes money. And that there's a bit of a kind of ostentation to that. And I think we're meant to, if we're interpreting this anti-Semitically, as indeed I am, that we should perhaps feel that this is a man who can't suit this suit, who we can see who he is even in this suit that maybe is trying to disguise the sort of dirty origins. That's how I interpret that.
Devorah has hit the nail on the head. I agree that Jewish humour was often used to disguise dirty origins, and I'm reminded of something Daniel Appleby, Julian's unofficial biographer, said to me about the fate of Hebrew comedy as an art form.
I think his act would have died during the 1930s, frankly. I don't think it would have even gone that far. I think Hitler would have killed it. I just don't think that Julian's comedy would have been sustainable into the 1930s. There were Jewish comics in Britain in the late 1930s who, to some extent, tried to inherit the mantle of Julian Rose, but the humour that they did was much blander, much gentler, much more benign.
And yet, as Devorah Baum points out in her book, humour is one of the defining features of Jewish identity. When the going gets tough, the Jews get jokey.
Somebody sent me a Jewish joke I hadn't heard they found circulating on the internet the other day. Apparently it's everywhere on the internet at the moment. I guess it's a sort of coronavirus sort of era joke, but it's a priest and an imam and a rabbi are all asked what they want said about them at the funeral, and the priest says, I want them to say I was a very charitable man, and the imam says, I want them to say I was a man of faith and wisdom, and the rabbi says, I want them to say, look, he's moving.
Jokes were and are instrumental to the survival of the Jewish people. This was especially true after the Holocaust.
One thing I mention in the book is that for the great late Aaron Applephile, who was a child during the Holocaust, survived the war, then went to Israel, or what was becoming Israel after the war, and became a great novelist and writer. But in his memoir, he says that in the displaced persons camps after the war, there was absolutely no language that anybody had. Nobody was sort of saying, hey, how was the concentration camp? Nobody was having those conversations. How are you doing? You know, how did you find camp life? Or that just wasn't possible. Nobody was saying to each other, did you lose? Who did you lose? Nobody had a language to talk about what had just happened and what they'd witnessed and what they'd been through. He said, so the only way in which it ever got referred to was through these sort of grotesque comic performances. And so it was almost like the only language that could appear at that moment wasn't the language of tragedy. That would have been completely inappropriate. Any attempt at pathos would have been, you know, so politically incorrect, or whatever kind of incorrect you would choose. Whereas the language of comedy, which seems and sounds to our ears more inappropriate, was sort of naturally reached for as the only way in which these experiences could be alluded to or addressed at all at that time of immediacy. So it completely reverses the rule of comedy being tragedy plus time. I'm saying, no, comedy is the language that comes first when something as shattering as that has broken the world.
Hey, don't you go away. I want to tell you how they jazz it up in Nathan's Cabaret.
My great-grandfather didn't live long enough to see the world shattered. He died in 1935, at the age of 66. Although he was at the top of his career when he died, his estate was worth a mere £80. Julian Rose left behind 2 children, one of which bore his name, Julian Rose Jr. In the process of making this documentary, I learned of a 3rd child from an earlier marriage, my great-uncle. Nobody in my family had ever heard of him. After almost 100 years, Julian continues to surprise and confound his audience. Perhaps most surprising to me were the results I received from 23andMe's mail-in DNA kit. According to the results, I am 15.8% Ashkenazi Jewish and over 40% English, German and French. The lesson I've taken from that is that I can buy a croissant in France, drive to Germany, and then complain about it to somebody.
When they played that Yiddish, once I made some Mauritius, he commenced the chalking dishes. When they played that Yiddish, Mr. Siegel done a shimmy, someone hit a bit of Jimmy. When they played that Yiddish jazz.
My great-grandfather was a complicated man living in a complicated time. Was he an anti-Semite? No, I don't think so. He was Jewish after all. Did he profit off of anti-Semitism? To a degree, I think the answer is yes. But am I proud to be related to him? Absolutely. No legacy is perfect, and no performer can future-proof their material. Hell, in 100 years, my great-grandchildren will probably listen to this and shudder. Or maybe they'll just be annoyed I didn't do more to prevent global warming. Sorry, kids.
I'm very glad to see you here tonight on this solemn and suspicious occasion.
In the end, I think I should let Julian have the last word. It's what he was good at.
Personally, I think the show is rotten. It's my show. I can say what I like about it. But a lot of silly fools come here and spend good money to see a show like that. Maybe I'm wrong. And I'm glad I ain't.
The late Julian Rose, the penultimate act in today's show, Only Joking. It was written and produced by David Rose, the sound engineer was Melissa May, and the supervising producer was Michelle Rayner. I'm Kirsty Melville. Thanks for joining me for another deep dive into the past on The History Lesson. Catch you next time.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio, and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.